This was written by my colleague Robbie Walsh during Easter week 1982. The light green shoots of blossoms to have been are out of sight under the drifting snow. Gale force winds are rattling the old house. The temperature is far below freezing. Nature is not cooperating with preparations for Easter. The storm evokes the spiritual quality of Good Friday more than Easter. New life will appear, but not without strife, not without some losses to the coldness which returns as inevitably as spring. And who can say that the sun will always climb again on Easter morning? Isn't it at least possible that the coldness has more staying power than the warmth? The seasons are more reliable in these matters than human nature. For we individually and collectively can choose between love and indifference, between commitment and self-absorption, between peace and war. And we have often chosen the coldness. Maybe the ancients were right. Maybe the spring comes because we bid it come in our celebrations. Maybe it is the telling and the retelling of the stories that enable us to see that hope still lives and that we can carry it forward. The stories make it clear that God does not do it alone. The motions of the spheres will produce a sunrise, but the springtime of the Spirit, the springtime of love and justice and peace, depends on our human response to the gift of life. Let us tell the stories again. May it be so this morning. Amen. Last summer, I had occasion to participate in the Women's Peace Encampment at the Seneca Army Depot, where neutron bombs are stored. The depot is about 10 miles from our cottage on Seneca Lake and is served by a railroad that is contiguous to our property. One evening, I took our older boy, Ben 16, to the encampment. Ever since attending the UU United Nations seminar in the spring of 1983, he has been a budding activist. We visited the farm where the women lived, talked with some of them, and then set out to find members of our congregation who were to participate in a vigil at the depot entrance. As we drove by in the gathering dusk, I spotted the vigil, and at the same time noticed an enlarging knot of townspeople who had come to stare and heckle at best, to do mischief at worst. The police were there with their flashing lights. There had been incidents, and having gone through many demonstrations in the past, including Selma, I was apprehensive. We did not immediately spot our friends, and so I was prepared to leave when my son asked me, why, and urged me to stop. Heart in throat, I did. We walked past the townspeople, heard their anger, and said our words of encouragement to those on vigil. I learned something about myself that night, my own anxiety, my son's commitment, and my own sense that these women were laying their lives on the line for what I and they believed in. My son and I came closer together that night. We both clarified our values and what they meant for our behavior. Out of a simple gesture of social action came enhanced life meaning. I knew then that one reason I seek to change the world is for the Son who made me face up to my convictions. In the Christian tradition, today is Palm Sunday, Today's story is told of Jesus riding into Jerusalem. Last year, we explored some of the symbolism and the politics of the day to understand the story more fully in its historical context. This year, I invite us to fast forward a few thousand years to what this story might continue to teach us today about ourselves and our own journeys, particularly as we work to create justice. A recap of the story. Jesus rides in on a donkey. Crowds gather. They wave palms at him and pave the road with branches and their own cloaks. They have such hope in this man, such expectation that he has the potential to lead them, to make changes, to bring freedom. The question I want to think about today is what happened to those joyous crowds after that palm waving day? The people were all for Jesus when he was riding triumphantly into the city. But then he continued to do what Jesus does best, disrupting the social order. We forget sometimes what a radical social justice activist Jesus was. When he came to the temple in Jerusalem, he was outraged that it had been turned into a marketplace. People were swindling tourists and turning that holy place into a place to get rich quick. Sound at all familiar? Jesus was so mad, he turned over the tables of the money changers. Coins went flying everywhere. He yelled at them to get out. Then he started healing people. Blind people, poor people, really sick people. It was like the very first version of universal health care. And not everyone was a fan. And he told everyone to love God and to love their neighbors. Those were the two most important things, he said. Now, Jesus wasn't perfect. He got kind of annoyed by the people who weren't that good at loving their neighbors as themselves. He had a bit of a temper. He cursed a fig tree and it died. That wasn't very nice of him. But you know, we all have bad days, and being a leader is hard. The crowd was kind of disappointed, though. This was it. This was the glorious new king who was going to change things. All he's doing is turning over tables and telling us to love our neighbors as ourselves. When the people realized that he wasn't going to change things for them in a big, dramatic political or military coup, but rather through the slow and hard work of relationship building and sharing, they were kind of put off. That hard, slow change wasn't really the kind of change they were hoping for. So they dispersed. And by the time the temple leaders got fed up with him and the Romans came for him, the crowds were gone. Only his small group of supporters had stayed, and not even all of them remained loyal. We all know the story doesn't end well. Soon Jesus is betrayed and the government has him killed. He doesn't have a crowd there calling him king anymore. They are gone. The only crowd there is calling for his death. We don't tell the whole story at once because it's a kind of depressing one. The Christian tradition focuses on one piece of the story at a time. Because that's all we can really bear, isn't it? It's manageable in pieces. The Palm Sunday piece is good. That's the celebration part with the palm waving. Maundy Thursday brings the Last Supper and foot washing. It's humble, but reassuring in a way. Good Friday, not much good there, just betrayal, suffering, death. But we only have to tell and hear and sit with that part of the story for one day. Easter Sunday really redeems the story. We get to hear that one next week. And I know not all of us connect with this story at all. We wonder why we have to hear it every year if Jesus is not central to our theology. But I think we can learn a lot from thinking about these ancient stories as long as we keep asking questions about them. For instance, what if we spend some time wondering about what happens in between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday? To think about that crowd and what caused them to abandon the work Jesus was calling them to when they had been so excited to welcome him. That's where it helps to connect the story to our own lives, to put ourselves in the crowd and think about what it would have been like. I remember that moment in college when I realized for the first time that doing what was right was not always a black and white choice, and that it was not always confirmed or rewarded. I think I've told you this story before. I was attending a protest rally after the shooting of Amadou Diallo. You might remember the case. Amadou Diallo was a 22-year-old black man shot by New York City police officers 41 times when he reached for his wallet to show them his ID outside of his home. And in the midst of chanting the numbers 1 to 41 with the rest of the crowd, I looked up and suddenly noticed that I was the only white person in the crowd. Suddenly, my confidence in the rally was shaken. It wasn't because I was uncomfortable being the only white person. It was that I didn't understand why there weren't more white people there, if it had clearly been an injustice that needed to be witnessed. Wasn't this shooting of an innocent black man a clear instance of racism? Suddenly, I wasn't sure. Suddenly, without the reassurance of people who looked like me, I was swimming in that gray area of conscience. Suddenly, I was figuring out if my individual conviction had legs, and how committed I was willing to be to walk on them. Remember that reading from earlier about Richard Gilbert and his son? Staying at that vigil wasn't an easy thing for them either. It took some work to stay there, some commitment, even in the face of discomfort and doubt. But after they put in the hard work, it actually strengthened their commitment, their convictions, their faith. He said, out of a simple gesture of social action came enhanced life meaning. Now the crowd outside Jerusalem was all in for the simple gesture of social action. They were happy to gather in the streets to welcome a figure they thought could bring change. But a week later, that had all changed. They had forgotten or lost hope or given up. They were not by Jesus' side as he was condemned to die for challenging the order of things. Perhaps they each had their own story of what else they had to do instead, other places they had to be, or why it was too hard to stay with Jesus. He wanted them to give up things. He wasn't popular with those in power. To join him required associating with some pretty uncomfortable people. It would take a whole lot more time than they had bargained for. And he wasn't the perfect leader. There was that whole fig tree incident, remember? But those folks who stood by Jesus, boy, were their lives changed forever. Today, on Palm Sunday, we begin to walk to Jerusalem with the crowd. But we have some decisions to make on our journey. Regardless of our theology, we have some questions to ask ourselves based on this story. When it comes to creating real change in this world, are we there only for the palm waving moments? Or are we in for the long haul? When the crowds have parted, will we still be walking beside Jesus, Martin Luther King, undocumented immigrants, people searching for housing on Cape Cod, women and men seeking to leave a cycle of violence, members of the Racial Justice Project? When our palm fronds have dried up and become brittle reminders over the mantelpiece, will we replace them with signs that say Black Lives Matter, closed pilgrim, and standing on the side of love for a living wage? When our arms are tired from banner waving, will we take a seat at a table registering people to vote in a folding chair at town meeting, on a bus to the State House? It's easy to take part in Palm Sunday. It's easy to join the gathering crowd to welcome a promising leader. It's easy to take up a sign and remember Selma 50 years on, to celebrate justice and hope. Maybe we do have to overcome some of our own fears and misgivings to participate, but that's not sacrifice. That's not sustained solidarity. That's not the real work that is required of us. That's not what changes things. The work that is required of us begins when the crowds disperse. When we are the only one in front of town hall holding a sign and we begin to doubt our convictions. When we are off to meet with our elected officials again, even though we did it last year and we're not sure it made a difference. When we are the only white person in a crowd, or when we are the only person of color at a meeting again. When we are working side by side with people who are really different than us, and we're not totally comfortable. Or when we are taking the lead from a leader who is not perfect. The real work of Palm Sunday can be lonely work. It can be soul-searching work. It asks much of us, not just once, but over and over again. I'm not saying we should skip the palm waving moments. They are important. They are what keep us going. But on the road to justice, they are few and far between, and in between lies the real work of justice making. The real work of alleviating hell and creating heaven here on earth. We join together for the palm waving moments so that we can remember that we are not alone during those lonely moments. So that we remember that although it doesn't always feel that way, we are doing this work in community. That there is a community calling us beyond our comfort zones and into the messy world. And we celebrate those moments to feed our spirits, to strengthen ourselves so that we can be in it for the long haul, sustained for the whole journey, the journey toward creating a better world together. I hope you have your palms. Together, now let us raise our palms in hope for a better world. Look around and see the community that is working for this better world with you.